Yeah, I'm confused about this. Look, mental health is a serious issue, often more pressing and destructive than physical health. A killer, a malaise that can impact and dominate your life. Look, we all know that, we all get that, nobody wishes to undermine that. But does it become, as I said to our last guest, Alex, a get-out-of-jail-free card if you've done something wrong? Even if you haven't broken the law. Huw Edwards is a man that has a history of depression. He joins tens of thousands of others. I sympathise. I can only imagine what that feels like. I wish him a speedy recovery, and I hope the man gets the help he needs for the sake of his children as much as anything else. What I don't fully understand, and help me out here, is whether the alleged mucky behaviour of this man can in any way be excused because of a mental health issue. It would seem more likely, I think, to most, that any potential breakdown that someone's had is more likely as a result of getting rumbled for those issues. Now, of course we await more detail. I'm hearing a lot of people say the man's done nothing illegal. I don't think illegality is the focus of this discussion. That really isn't the focus. And a curious moment yesterday when Sophie Rayworth delivered the main headline on the 6 o'clock news, which began with the remark that Huw Edwards had resigned from the BBC. Within about 30 seconds, they rectified this. Oh, no, he hasn't actually resigned. He's just off, and he's now put himself into hospital. He's getting in-hospital care. One assumes that's some kind of private hospital. So he hasn't resigned. And I kind of expected that that would be perhaps the first thing we might hear, given that there's been no denial of the allegations against him. And again, we're not dealing with illegality. That is not the focus. We are dealing with the face of British news from the state-funded broadcaster. He embodies the entirety of what it means to trust somebody, what it means to trust the source, the delivery. This is somebody like a warm pair of slippers that sits there within your own living room telling you the good news, the bad news and everything in between. That takes a level of trust. The BBC looked long and hard to find the right faces that tick that particular box. And he was the man. He was the man right at the centre of it. I don't know how you come back after these kind of allegations about certain types of behaviour, regardless of whether it's perfectly legal. That is not the focus of this one. But what it has done for many is sort of drawn a bit of a line under it. You know, I'm seeing social media who seemed only too happy to name this man, even though that would have been illegal at the time. And now it's like, no, you've got to, poor man, he's going through it, he's going through the mill, leave him there, he's done nothing wrong. Well, when you do that for what he does for a living, I think we could very convincingly make an argument that he possibly has done something very wrong on this. Let's get the latest. Holly Hudson is our talkTV correspondent outside New Broadcasting House. Are we getting any more detail from our state broadcaster, Holly? Good afternoon.
Good afternoon to you, Ian. Yes, as you say, a spotlight still very firmly fixed on the BBC today amid fresh allegations by its own programme, BBC Newsnight, over Huw Edwards' conduct. Newsnight claiming that 3 people have come forward, to current, one former member of staff, making allegations about his conduct and say they received inappropriate, flirtatious messages and raising issues over an abuse of power, which causing, of course, an even bigger headache for the BBC. And on top of that, reports emerging that that same programme, that Newsnight, may have been working on an expose on Edwards' behaviour, may have been looking into claims about him before even the Sun published its initial story containing those initial allegations by the mother and stepfather that their child, their teenager, was paid tens of thousands of pounds by Huw Edwards for sexually explicit images, raising yet more questions for the broadcaster to answer, and in particular what managers knew and when they knew it, and of course how they've handled all of this. Now, we know that the BBC is taking a two-pronged approach. It's launched a review into its complaints procedure when things are red flagged, as the Director General Tim Davie put it, after it emerged, of course, that it took 7 weeks before that complaint by the mother and stepfather that they made to the BBC was raised to Huw Edwards himself and to senior management. Secondly, separate to that, they are looking internally at the workplace culture and these new claims regarding Huw Edwards' conduct. So lots of questions still for the BBC to answer over all of this. We know that the Director General, Tim Davie, is going to be questioned in Parliament next week, and in a memo to staff he said that they are navigating a complex set of circumstances and their immediate concern is the duty of care to employees. He also called on others to come forward. But you touched on it there, really, Ian. Look, we know that there are a lot of people in this building behind me here, and a lot of people in the media knew Huw Edwards' name before it was uncovered by his wife in that statement yesterday. But this news will have come as a shock to many. This is a widely respected, well-known face, the face of BBC News, one of the most trusted broadcasters, and trust is obviously integral, central to the BBC's core values. And in that sense, there is an argument that this is in the public interest. Of course, there have been questions levelled at the Sun newspaper over their coverage of this, over the media's coverage of this. We know that the Sun say they have no more plans to publish any more allegations about Huw Edwards. They say they've handed over their dossier of wide-ranging information that also includes more allegations from BBC staff to the BBC to help it conduct its internal investigation. And they say that they never allege any criminality had taken place. But there are many people, as you also mentioned, that will be upset by this for that reason. This is a man that has broken some of the biggest news, that has essentially held Britain's hand through some of its most testing times, its biggest stories, broken news of the Queen's death and covered the King's coronation and also, you know, broken news of COVID and lockdowns, etc. And that is, again, why this may be of importance and interest to the public, because one of the allegations, one of the accusations is, of course, that he broke lockdown rules. That's what the Sun report said last week or this week, that he travelled across the city, across London, to meet with a stranger from a dating app during the third COVID lockdown. Now, there's obviously arguments on either side here, and the BBC now will have to look and answer those questions in terms of what happens here at the corporation and in the workplace, whether those staff felt confident enough that they could come forward, or whether there was an abuse of power here in relation to Huw Edwards. But we're in a situation now, Ian, where we know, of course, that the presenter, the star at the centre of all of this, who has been unmasked, has been uncovered, is in hospital. He's suffered a serious medical episode. He's suffering from mental health issues, and it's unknown at present whether he will return to our screens, if at all.
Holly, thank you. Holly Hudson, talkTV correspondent outside New Broadcasting House. I'll bring some comment from you in on this in a few moments. Let's chat to Dave Mason. We chatted to Dave at the beginning of the week when this story was still in a sort of speculation mode, crisis consultant at Media Mentor. Listen, Dave, how are you doing?
Ian, good to see you again.
Good to see you too. Well, welcome back. We now have the name of the person that, I mean, pretty much everybody knew at the time, but now it's official. What do we make about the BBC's handling of this so far? They announced it on their own 6 o'clock news. They continued on their 10 o'clock news. They gave the statement from his wife. They even talked about there being allegations against Mr. Edwards from within the BBC. Are they doing enough so far?
Well, it's extraordinary, isn't it? We find ourselves in the same sort of position that ITV found itself in only a matter of weeks ago over the Philip Schofield affair, and then everybody navel-gazing because in this instance, BBC News a couple of days ago couldn't really give any comment about how the organisation was answering any of these claims, because BBC News couldn't get answers from BBC management because it's an independent and separate directorate. Now, of course, BBC News is investigating itself because it's an HR matter, and even Newsnight now, we're back to post-Savile with Newsnight investigating the BBC News department. So we're in this, not only are we in this wider feeding frenzy of the media, you know, ourselves, you, others reporting on this in a way which happened with ITV and Philip Schofield to the point of saturation only a few weeks ago. We're also in this holding pattern where the BBC seems to have learned nothing from the Jimmy Savile period and the time that Newsnight was investigated by Panorama over what it knew of Savile, a period where the BBC doesn't seem to have learned particularly from the fallout from Cliff Richard and changing some of its internal processes in order to ensure that names come out. Okay, on this occasion, Huw Edwards' name didn't come out until his wife made that move yesterday, and that part of the process seemed to work. But I bring it back to this and what I said earlier in the week. The bit of the BBC internal management process, which is led from the top, that has not worked and isn't working, is the risk management part of it. Identifying risk and what risk could escalate and become more of a problem, spotting those, managing them. And the thing with risk and issues management and crisis is when you work out what's a risk to your organization, you then decide which of those risks could become an issue. If they are likely to become an issue, you have to have a process and a way of managing issues. If you don't manage those issues well, those incubate, and then those issues can become a crisis.
Yeah.
Now, there are two important factors in this, Ian, that I have to differentiate. An organizational crisis for most companies isn't of any interest to the media or the wider public whatsoever. A train operating company or an airport could have issues and risks and problems going on every day, and it never gets in the media. But when you are a media organization with household names, trusted, well-known people that come into our living rooms every evening on the TV, risk is a very different issue for you and a different matter, and it needs to be treated differently. So where a lot of organizations have gone wrong, ITV and the BBC, is that they're not putting the fact that they are a high-profile media organization at risk of being reported on by lots of other media organizations high on their risk of probability. And the fact that the BBC can sit on this for 7 weeks and not recognize that an issue regarding one of its star newsreaders would be something that would not only be national news, but is international news and be reported on at length for days and days and days, beggars belief. ITV made the same mistake. And just while we're on this point of lockdown and whether or not any illegality took place, let's not forget that there is the potential, and we don't know what the outcome of an internal investigation is going to be here, but people do come back from having made mistakes. Sky News suspended Kay Burley after breaking lockdown rules and their chief political correspondent for attending a party during lockdown for 6 months, and they came back. So it's not to say that when wrongdoing occurs, that person never comes back on screen again, because there is precedent for this.
Indeed. Dave, it's always thorough stuff. Thank you for your assessment on that. Dave Mason is crisis consultant at Mentor Media. But I don't know whether you can you really come back and read the news? I mean, regardless of where you work, by the way. I think the point becomes a far more urgent, prevalent point when it's the BBC, funded by the taxpayer. This is meant to be the organisation that has no skeletons in the cupboard in that respect. It's a pure and simple, it's a very thoroughbred organisation. That is kind of what it's meant to be. The public palate expects that of the BBC. How would a newsreader who, and again, I stress the fact that this person has arguably done nothing illegal, but that's not the focus of the point. I think we're losing our minds if we focus that on being the point. But if you've got somebody who is being investigated internally for impropriety against junior members of staff. Sorry, since when did that get a free pass? Since when did... I've got one here from Tony, says he'll be back despite this homophobic tirade on the BBC. You think we wouldn't be talking about this if it was a man and young girls that we were talking about? At what point does the country's most senior and well-known newsreader, whose outside proclivities we are now all too aware of, It doesn't matter that they're not illegal. You think you could go back and read the news with all of that? At what point would that be okay? His own company is investigating him. That's homophobic to investigate somebody? I mean, let's put aside the fact of the lack of trust from a married man with 5 kids and what the hell those poor people are going through right now. Let's put that to one side. I mean, seriously, is that where we're at? It doesn't matter, it's absolutely fine, nothing illegal. Get him back on reading the news. How is he going to cope with the next story that has echoes of this one if he was sitting there reading the 10 o'clock news? He couldn't. It would be impossible. So you can have every sympathy you like against somebody's breakdown. I mean, 48 hours ago, very high-profile former BBC people were saying they'd spoken to Mr. Edwards and he was very angry. There was not a sniff of anything else beyond anger at that point. They obviously didn't name him. And here we are with what could be argued, someone continuing to use their power, and power is a big factor in all of this, by saying, I'm drawing a line under this, I'm checking myself into hospital. Again, I'll emphasise this for people like Tony or the other hard of hearing out there, that we all sympathise with that. But did that become as a result of an exposure or as a result of something else? And I think we know where most people really believe that's come from. And thank you to Tony for your text, but I don't believe you'd say that out loud to anybody because you'd be laughed out the room, mate.